You are now listening to the Building with AI Promises and Heartbreaks podcast, brought to you by Solid.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Building with AI Promises and Heartbreaks. Today, I have Joel Hron with me here on the podcast. Joel Hron is the CTO at Thomson Reuters, where he leads product engineering and AI R&D across legal, tax, audit, trade, compliance, and risk. He is driving the next wave of innovation in professional technology by combining human expertise with advanced AI to solve the most complex challenges in knowledge work. Joel joined Thomson Reuters in 2022 through the acquisition of ThoughtTrace, where he served as CTO. Since then, he has helped transform the company's technology strategy. While leading TR Labs and AI, his teams launched 7 generative AI products in just 18 months, including AI assistants for legal research, tax research, and contract drafting. These tools are already changing how professionals work, making expert tasks faster, more accessible, and more impactful. Welcome. It's great to have you, Joel.
Thanks for having me.
So, Joel, if you don't mind, maybe let's start with a bit about what is Thomson Reuters. A lot of people know Reuters through the news agency, but if you could kind of describe a bit about what Thomson Reuters is about, and also maybe what is the transition Thomson Reuters is going through, as we're going into the future.
Yeah, that was actually, when we got approached prior to the acquisition, one of my first reactions of like the news company, like they do software too. And as I did more research, obviously, and learned more about the company throughout the process, I learned that it was a tremendous business, like the largest software provider in the world, or at least in the top 3 across all of those industries you mentioned: legal, tax, compliance, audit. So I really learned quite a bit through that process. And one of my sort of core charges since I joined the company was to really try to help with our brand as a technology company, because that's really truly who we were throughout many of the years. And in particular, one of the things that I came to learn through that process as well is that the company actually had like a tremendously rich history in AI and machine learning. The Thomson Reuters Labs, which you mentioned, I led for a couple of years, has actually existed for 30 plus years, and has really been working in the field of AI and machine learning as it relates to search and information retrieval problems. So when you think about legal, tax, compliance, audit, these are like expert information systems at the end of the day. Like our job as Thomson Reuters across those different domains is to deliver content in the form of cases or tax law or whatever, but guidance as well as to how experts should apply that information in their day-to-day job. And like I said, we deliver that through content, we deliver it through software, through workflow, other types of things. But many of those problems come down to information retrieval and search, at least historically. So a lot of the history of TR in AI and machine learning really centered around these natural language processing type use cases, but in particular search and retrieval type use cases as well, which honestly has served as a tremendous foundation for building a lot of the generative AI products that we build today. And it actually, makes some of the generative AI problems that we solve some of the harder problems, I think, in the world to solve because of the, reliance on truthful and trustworthy information in those processes. Some use cases are about creativity and sort of solving the blank page problem, but in many cases, like they're grounded in a really like precise and deep understanding of the domain and how do you sort of constrain and control AI to operate in those contexts. Has been some of the more fun work that we've done.
Yeah, because if people rely on you on legal research, tax research, that's the last place you want to have mistakes and hallucinations and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
News is full of stories of lawyers using AI to write their cases. And
Every week I feel like there's a new one.
Yeah, exactly. Every week there's a new one. Even some papers coming out of Congress sometimes that have those mistakes. So it's the last place you want to You want to have that. So Thomson Reuters essentially was doing AI before AI was cool again, because AI became cool, not cool, came
Yeah.
cool, not cool. So
Funny
even
backstory,
before
we
this time.
actually released the first software application that included semantic search like 20 something years ago, even
Yeah.
predating Google. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I've been doing this for a long time, and certainly this is a new world we're living in versus back then. But yeah, we've been heavily invested here for a while.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay. So you came in through that acquisition, 2022. November 2022, ChatGPT was released. So it's kind of an interesting timing. And then when leading the labs, you started implementing Gen AI based products, seven of those. Can you maybe pick one or two and describe them to us? What's the product about? What were you looking to do? Who are the users? Just to give us some context.
Yeah, so I took over the labs kind of serendipitously, kind of right at this time of the ChatGPT moment. And the rest of the engineering organization was like very akin to what you would think of as like a traditional software engineering organization, but there wasn't a lot of deep expertise within those teams as to like how to apply AI in a delivery context. And so we very quickly pivoted that labs organization, which at that time was about 120 people. Over the next 2 years, we more than doubled it to 250 plus now. But at that time, we really pivoted those 120 or so people into, previously they were much more like applied research and development, but they became much, much closer to our products and to our like delivery roadmaps in near-term context, because they were the ones who really had that expertise as to how to apply these. And as you think about many of the early use cases of generative AI, they all, and still to a degree today, center around this concept of RAG, or retrieval
Mhm.
augmented generation. And one of the sort of core foundational components of good RAG systems is good search at the
Yes.
end of the day, which like kind of is called context engineering a little bit today. But we actually had a lot of experts in the company who were really, really good at search. And so we really leveraged the assets that we had there and pivoted them around these kinds of use cases. And a couple of the earliest examples I'll give you maybe is on like the legal research and legal contract drafting use cases. And in particular, like what we found, like the first moment that this happened and we were just using ChatGPT or later some of these other models came out, like we were like, I think astounded as everybody else were, just how much world knowledge they actually did have, like how much parametric knowledge the models already had about the law and these kinds of things. And, you could get to 70% of the answer very quickly, but we really found that like the fringes were much harder. And that's why people buy products from us at the end of the day. It's not like Google answers 70% of legal questions, and Google answered 70% of legal questions 5 years ago too.
Yeah.
But it's these like hard legal questions that require nuance and understanding and depth that we really pride ourselves on. So those fringe cases were the opportunity for us to really leverage both what AI was capable of, but also our content and our experts in developing these systems. So that's what we did. We, in the very early days, like took our underlying search engines and started applying them into the context of RAG for these legal research applications. And I think we found really good success in the early days. We optimized our retrieval systems, like very much so around like how the language model needed to receive context
Mhm.
to understand it. And I think we were well equipped to do that. I think I wouldn't call this a failure, but this was certainly like a learning through that process. Like the concept of evaluation completely changed.
Yes.
And this idea that I could just like measure a recall of top three on a retrieval system was no longer viable, or the idea that I could measure an ML system based on like a precision and recall score was
Mhm.
not viable. Like the answers were much more subjective and open to interpretation, I would say. And so I would say in the early days, like we really struggled to understand, how do you build good evals? What does it mean to develop a rubric that's based on kind of expert knowledge? What levels of sort of automated eval can I have versus human eval? And
Mhm.
certainly in the early days, it was largely human eval, which slowed development cycles, right? And so we really tried to as many companies did, learn the hard way how to build good automated, but also human evals and when to include what type in the development flow. And then the real thing that was, I think, challenging in the early days is like, when is it good enough?
Yeah.
It's like you want to control these hallucinations, but you're never going to drive them to zero. So is it good enough to just be helpful 90% of the time, even if there's some errors, or do you want it to never be harmful? And so we sort of develop these concepts of like helpfulness, harmfulness, and things like this into our evals to try to control, like, how is a user actually going to perceive this at the end of the day? And it took quite a while to, I think, develop an understanding and a rhythm and a cadence for how we should talk about evals and how we should talk about fitness for production, and readiness to ship. And those are certainly things we learned over time and continue to learn today. But I would say those are some of the like hardest yards in the early days of AI models. On the drafting side of things as well, I think similar concepts in terms of RAG, like we've got content, we've got drafting notes, things like that. And it was just a different structure of, okay, how do you need to provide this content to the context of the LLM to be able to interpret it well and be able to make good judgments. I think one of the biggest learnings we had on that side, and this still happens today, it's like, you're building for something that is a known state of where AI is, and you spend a couple months building that, and by the time you're done with it, AI is at a new state.
Yes.
And like what you did, like probably could be done differently and should be done differently based on where it is. That still happens. I think it's plateaued a little bit, but in the early days, it was like changing quite rapidly. And I think one of the things that we learned is that there's this concept in software engineering of the MVP. And a lot of times what that leads product teams and engineering teams to do is sort of like make it too minimal. Like you sort of like scope the problem down to like a valuable but like hard thing that is minimally viable to get out the door. And with AI, we found like we were downscoping too much, and that if we had actually just like looked at a broader and harder problem to start with, like we would have solved, I think, the problem in a different way and probably in a better way that rode the curve of the exponential rather than forced us to like rebuild it from scratch, in 3 months. And so I think we've definitely shifted our tactics in terms of how we think about products to be more end-to-end, more holistic, like try to actually solve a big, hard problem and then focus on the components rather than focus on the components and then try to scale it from there.
Wow, there's so much to unpack. Two products. One is more legal search. The other one is drafting. Your users are lawyers in law firms. Is that a correct way to think about it?
Lawyers in law firms, lawyers in like corporate settings, like general counsel's offices,
Yes.
big law firms, all the way down to like single person law firms, the courts, every like federal judicial court in the US, many of the Supreme Courts, like, so a lot of government agencies, most of the world in law at this point.
Yeah. So important places, important people, important entities. You can't produce something that's 100%. So maybe let's start from there, because you talked about evals and human evals and automated and so forth. When a user comes into your system to use it to help them with drafting or with search, do you align expectations with them somehow? Do you say, other than there's always a note, AI could be wrong, et cetera, et cetera. But what is your goal? What do you see that you absolutely need to deliver on to them, and what things are you saying to them? Maybe you can't get this out of us, or you can, but check everything that we're saying, or whatever it may be. What's your expectation alignment or contract with them around that?
Yeah. So, I think it starts with setting expectations like in the sales and onboarding process, and like good education on like, here's how you should use it. Here are good tips, tricks, et cetera. So that's a given. I think the other things that we do is like in the system itself, build really strong intent resolution systems to be able to constrain the system itself to answer in the context that it is designed to answer. And sometimes to a user, when they're used to going to ChatGPT and asking anything under the sun and getting an answer, that can feel a little restricting. So we've had to like figure out how do we we balance those two things? But in the early days, I would say it was really like let's tightly guardrail this thing and make sure when we're answering, we're confident that like we have the correct context and content to ground the model effectively in what we're trying to do. And so we spent a lot of time on intent resolution and guardrailing in the early days to make sure that we were doing that. I think the other thing that we did in terms of setting expectations with the user is trying to like we were one of the few, I think, legal providers at the time that were providing such like comprehensive answers. Now with like reasoning models and longer context and these kind of things, it's become more normal. Like a deep research system will give you a 10-page report. But back then, it was like pretty short, punchy answers. But we were providing like comprehensive multi-page answers at times in those early days. And our focus with that was really to provide as much context as we could to the user, to let them make the decision around what judgment they're trying to make at the end of the day. And then I think lastly is like the UX of the application itself. So, good citations to references. When we cite a case, for instance, like we deep link that directly to the case that's referenced in Westlaw. And if there's no deep link, like there's no case, and it's a bad site, and it's probably a hallucination. So like these kind of like visual cues that help the user understand where do I need to do deeper research or deeper validation are things that we try to build into the UX rather than just like standing up a pure chatbot. Try to use the UX of the applications that existed like Westlaw to facilitate further engagement from the user rather than them just taking the answer from the system and going on with their day.
So there are a few really interesting things here. So first of all, understanding what the user is expecting and trying to give them as much information as possible so they can make the decision. Well, AI is not replacing humans here. They're helping make better decisions and providing information. And also this point about Westlaw, there's all these discussions around AI not sending traffic to websites and trying to bring all the decisions into the AI. You made a very conscious decision of we can summarize, we can help, we can draft, but the source systems are still the source systems. And since this is, such an important and sensitive process, we link back to the source systems. We expect people to look at the case law, not just rely on the AI. We inform them about it. The UX supports it, pushes them in that direction so that they get the thought piece, the summary, the analysis, but then they all need to still go into the cases and look at them. So it saved them a lot of time, but also grounds it in that truth. And Westlaw is still a
and the source systems themselves have content, but they also have tools that aid in further research. Right? We've built tools in that application for decades to aid in this process, and so the idea is like try to always link back to that. Try to always give them a synopsis of what we see, but then give them the ability to jump deeper with the tools they already have. I think not to jump too far ahead, but with agents now, that's gotten quite interesting because now what we're doing with the latest versions of research that we've released, like we released a deep research for Westlaw, and now AI is actually able to use those downstream tools in the same way a human would use to like validate its research and check its citations and these kind of things, like follow the breadcrumb trails. And so we've taken Westlaw as an application, not just the content, but the tools and capabilities within it, and expose these things as tools for our agent to actually use to do legal research in a way that very much mimics like how a human would use Westlaw to do legal research. And it's just been like a monumental leap forward in terms of the quality of what we're able to produce with that.
ChatGPT, not ChatGPT, OpenAI recently talked about how Codex moved from being an intern software developer to a junior software developer, and now they consider it to be a senior software developer. If you had to look at that agent and say, what is the equivalent human, like, is it a paralegal, a legal intern, a junior lawyer or associate? Like, where, if you had to give that agent a ranking that's equivalent to human, could you? And what would it be?
I'm sure somebody who knows the levels of lawyer career path would be better at that than I am. Like I could definitely say if we were a paralegal before, we're an associate now. I
Okay.
mean, we've gotten
It's
feedback from
amazing.
customers that say like, you know, the reports we're generating are like 100-hour research projects for a team of lawyers and we're
Same.
doing it in like 10 minutes. That's not to say it's 100% right too, though. I think the same principles apply of what I said before around providing, good audit trails of what the agents are doing, good citations back to source systems, like comprehensiveness of the answer in terms of like providing information on both sides and what we're uncertain about. So all those elements that I mentioned before certainly still apply, but the starting point that we're able to give them is far better than what it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's incredible. Okay. So lawyers are using it, there's the UX part that helps them understand what they can and cannot use it. I'll take now a step back. I'm going from the end a bit backwards. So then there's the evals. So you talked about automated evals, human evals. Did you end up building your own eval system, or did you use something that exists? How did you decide what to put in there? And obviously, you guys were building at the beginning of this, so maybe a lot of this, the playbook here wasn't written yet. So
Yep.
yeah, how did you think about the evals?
Yeah. So in the early days, and even today, we do a mix, honestly, of our own eval systems that we have built, as well as some third-party eval systems that help with certain things. I think the biggest part of the early days was really designing the rubrics for evals. Again, it wasn't this idea of precision and recall, but it was these ideas of like completeness, coherence, helpfulness, harmfulness, factuality. These are now like industry standard terms in many ways, but like they weren't then. And so it was really about trying to find rubrics that like we felt were representative of good quality. And then training our editorial team. So one of the great things about working at Thomson Reuters is like we have a team of 4,000 plus experts in these domains, legal, tax. I think we're like one of the largest employers of lawyers in the world. And that
Same.
human resource is insane. Like in many ways, like I think even more than data, we're sort of past the internet scale data wave. Like the real lifeblood of high quality AI systems is high quality experts in really deep niche domains. And so having that's a tremendous asset for us. And so training them in terms of like how do you score these systems? How do you think about this was also part of what we developed pretty early on. I think in the early days, we were really focused on like how do we use LLMs as a judge and get more automation into this process. And if I can look at like all the improvements in AI over the last 3 years, that's one that really like it's gotten better, but it's still hard. I still wouldn't
Mhm.
say that like I'm confident in just sending an LLM as a judge and shipping a product based on that. We always run it through a cycle of human eval at certain checkpoints. But we have developed, automated systems now that do speed up the development loops for our engineers faster so that they can test multiple ideas before they send it to a human eval. Part of that has been not just developing the sort of algorithms for how to do automated eval, but the data itself that's necessary to run on these automated evals has been something we've put in place. So I would say that's kind of where we are today. Is like we use public benchmarks. We have developed our own internal benchmarks with our own data sets and our own experts. A handful of which we can fully automate and get good signal on whether A or B looks better, but we're still heavily reliant on human eval to make, you know, shipping and delivery decisions and milestone checkpoints of progress.
Okay. So, and I would say that the same sort of parallel happened to us at Solid. Initially, we were trying to use just AI as a judge, but we saw that as a judge, it's nice, but it's not good enough. We had to keep the human in the loop. In our case, it's analysts that we employ. In your case, it's thousands of lawyers, which is incredible. And it makes sense, and it's probably going to be there for a while. AI will get better. As you pointed earlier, the models are getting better and better, but of course, humans are always needed here.
Yeah, I mean, if you can fully take the human out of the loop, it sort of implies that that maybe what you're doing isn't hard enough in the first place, right?
Oh, I like that.
So I don't know. I don't think it should ever go away. I think like
Yeah.
if we're trying to build better systems like that are more akin to humans, then we're gonna need humans to like really guide where that goes.
If we're aspirational enough, we'll need humans. If we don't need humans, we're not aspirational enough. It's kind of
Yeah.
the way to think about it. I love that. That's fantastic. That's a great way to look at it. You talked a bit earlier. You mentioned it just that you aimed a bit too narrow, and if you would have been bigger, you would have solved it differently. Aiming wider also means you need more evals, you need better logics, you need to involve humans more. So it all kind of goes together. But it sounds like you'd rather aim bigger, wider, and more aspirational versus and require all these things versus narrow and, a simpler UX, a simpler experience, a simpler evals. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's easy to say now. That was hard to see 3 years ago. But I think that that's true for now. And like, a good example of this would have been like day one when we were building drafting systems. Like we were talking about how do I let's say I get a contract in and it's got some provision around termination, and I
Hmm.
want to modify this termination provision to make it more like market standard. And so that's a very like easy, not easy, but like very like contextual RAG problem, which is to say, here's my termination provision. I'm going to go search what practical law says about termination and what good market termination clauses is, and I'm going to use those two things in context to like make a new clause that's better. And so that's a very narrow problem. And then you fast forward 6 months, and all of a sudden, like context windows are a million tokens,
Yeah.
and I can just draft the whole contract in one shot versus
Yeah.
a clause in one shot. You know what I mean? And so that's really like the pace of evolution that we were on in the early days, which forced us to like think bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think agents have taken it one step further, right? Like you put these tools together, you can really solve a whole like a more end-to-end problem. And one of the things that I think that's helpful for is that like when you solve the end-to-end problem, you're able to much better see like where is the system falling over. Like
Hmm.
you see problems that you didn't expect were going to be problems. You see things that you thought were going to be problems that actually turned out to be quite easily solvable. Like the LLM was able to reason through it for whatever reason, like quite well. And so building the whole system, you don't presuppose what's going to be hard and what's going to be easy. You sort of see it work.
Yeah.
And then you can more, I think, in a more informed way, dive into the things that matter. I think also now the sort of path of AI feels a little clearer. I'm almost like reluctant to say that because it sounds like a
Yeah.
little bit
Yeah. I was,
overconfident.
I was going to say, what do you mean?
But in the early days, you had these like everybody's talking about AGI and these systems that just had all this world knowledge, and they were going to go to billion token context windows, and RAG was going to die. And I feel like that's quieted a little bit, and what's really evolved is this concept of reasoning and agents and AI more as like an operating system rather than like an all-knowing being in and of itself. AI as an operating system. And if you look at like the training evolutions of ChatGPT 5 and Claude 4.5 and probably the next versions of Gemini, they're all being trained along this path of reasoning benchmarks, math and coding benchmarks, tool calling capabilities.
Mhm.
And so you can kind of look at this path of LLM development and kind of rationalize, okay, this is the path
Where
of
we're going.
architecture I should build my product around
Yeah.
to as the models scale in those dimensions, my product scales effectively with them. Whereas before it was like, who knew what the dimension was going to be? It was like they were just going to know everything about everything. And like, how do you build a strategy around that? Whereas now I feel like maybe there's developed a little bit more gravity around this idea of
Mhm.
reasoning and tool calling and kind of this operating system model for AI that I think in many ways lends itself quite well to a large legacy enterprise like ourselves in maybe a non-intuitive way. If you think about us, like we sell $7.5+ billion ARR company and probably have maybe 40 plus tier one products. I think 100
Mhm.
plus in total that we sell into the market. And within all of those is like deeply domain specific capabilities that have been built over decades that like do very specific things for legal research or contract drafting or, uh, case analysis or tax calculations or audit preparation. And if you think of AI as an operating system and you think about all these capabilities, it's just tools that you can expose for that operating system to use. Like it really creates quite like an extensible model for how AI can operate over like a pretty transverse portfolio of products like that. And so I think that's very much kind of like the ambition we have around agents and why we're quite excited about it, because I think it creates a lot of extensibility across our portfolio and what we can do with it.
So that actually brings us to the sort of the future, because I like to ask the question, okay, where are things going in 2026? So you're basically, if I understand it correctly, you're saying we will build these smart agents, central agents that will have all these tools at their disposal, tools that we've invested decades into at Thomson Reuters to build these capabilities, and now and they were always focused on humans leveraging those. Now they're going to be made available to agents to use, for agents to leverage. Is that kind of like the strategy going into 2026?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're heavily geared up around agents and as you mentioned, really exposing our existing capabilities of our products to be, and that doesn't mean just sort of like taking an API and making it an MCP server. Like you really need to, the same way you would design an API for a systems to system integration, or you would design a component in a UI for a human user, like you need to design these tools for an LLM or an AI agent to use, right? And they need to be designed with certain ergonomics to where the AI system can use them effectively and know when to use them at the right points in time and all this stuff. And so I think that's very much the work that we're doing now, though, and I think that's a really important kind of shift, I guess, in the last year that's happened with AI. I think the other dimension of the future with AI is also kind of what's happening with open source models and the evolutions of fine tuning and reinforcement fine tuning with tool use and things like this. And I think there's a big opportunity for like a larger mixture of models that work in concert with each other in this operating system context that we're excited about. And certainly like, I think we're very blessed in the sense to have so much of our own proprietary content and so many of our own human experts that like we really have a lot of the ingredients that are necessary to like really fine tune models and post train models for really specific things and make them highly accurate and highly performant. And so I see a bright future in terms of like how the ecosystem of models could work together going forward in that context as well.
Yeah, I would agree. On a call that, not on a call, on a podcast, I'm used to Zoom calls. On a previous episode, spoke with a guy called Tomasz, who's been building things. He's a VC, but also been building things himself. And he identified something that we also identified at Solid, that there are models that are much better at planning, and there are models that are much better at doing. And so, when you think about those plans of tool calls and bringing them together, what we're seeing is that the smaller models are really good at doing that, planning what to do, what to use, and how to use it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole sequence of things like drafting plans, but also like reasoning about next steps and adapting plans. And I think you're absolutely right. There's different models that are good at different things. And I think, you see like the latest versions of Claude Code and OpenAI just released Agent Kit. And these models are actually being trained to use the tools that they're developing within the agent SDKs as well. Right? And so there's this element of like, how do you train the model to use the tools that it has available to it to make it better rather than just through like prompting or descriptions? Here's what the tool does. Like train it to know when to use what tool in a learning process. And so I think, yeah, there's a bright future for where that will go as well, I think.
But I'm waiting for the day that I can, take a Word doc agreement and just, send it into something like, hey, redline this. And then maybe even later, just because I'm in startup world, right? So you have your lawyers, you're working on an investment or a customer deal, whatever. You introduce your lawyers into it, and you're just like, hey, I'll just introduce my agent here. You introduce your agent. They'll hash it out. By tomorrow, we'll have a clean agreement that we're
Yeah.
all good with and represents everyone's intentions. I'm hoping we get to that. Not because I don't like working with the people. Our lawyers are great, but I can completely see the efficiencies in there. When you're kind of thinking about this, amazing new world going to 2026, agents, tool use, etc., are there things that you're wondering, things that might break, might not work, things that you're concerned about from the perspective of getting this going? I know that it's hard to predict this, to your point, because the things you thought wouldn't work did work. The things you thought would be easy were hard. But if you go into 2026 and you had to imagine what would be hard, what do you think that would be?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that are going to be hard. I go back to evals. I think evals have only gotten harder, not easier. Like what is coming out of the model, is a more like complete and just larger body of work. So
Mhm.
like now out of research, instead of a 1-page report, I get a 20-page report. And so like a human going through that and finding all the things
Hard.
that are wrong with it is just a lot harder to do. There are many more steps that happen in between input output, and the steps and the sequences of steps are non-deterministic. And so being able to like identify, previously, for instance, like, this part of my retrieval pipeline or this stage of my re-ranking pipeline is not performing well. I need to go like improve my embedding model or like do this
Mhm.
whatever thing to make it better is no longer true. Like you gotta like, it's really hard to identify what part along this process do I need to improve to like hill climb the end to end. So I think this idea of evals is getting harder, both because the outputs are getting bigger and the sort of space in between is getting more opaque in terms of what's actually happening. So I think that's one thing I would say is going to be a challenge going forward. I think the other thing that's going to be a challenge going forward is performance. Like this whole idea of test time compute, like from a user experience, users don't always want to wait 20 minutes to get an answer. Sometimes they're very willing to and they're happy to because like it's a creative process and they just let it go. But other
Mhm.
times you need to be in flow with the user. So this idea of balancing latency is an important one. And then the third thing I would say is the user experience. Like, if you guys are using like AI engineering tools as an example, I think what you find is that really good engineers know how to use those tools really well because they're good at like making the micro decisions for the model that help guide it along the right path. It's not like they're just saying, here's my repo, go draft me an application that does X. Like they are working with this model to like plan what it's going to do and think about the edge cases and then set it off and then, re-steer it. And this, mechanism of how to keep humans in the loop and engaged along a longer running path, I think is a hard UX problem that every company is going to need to solve because it does. It takes tangents that you don't want it to take, and you need to like keep it on the rails. And you need to build good user experiences that facilitate doing that well. And I think that's going to be a hard problem to solve for
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah. There's the first problem you talked about, you could call sort of debuggability, right? We're in software, we're used to be able to, putting breakpoints and step into and step over and having watches so you can see what's going on. And in
And
this
it's
world,
testable. I can write a test and
testable.
it passed the test. And like,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Unit tests and integration tests and so forth. And here it's just so much harder. There are some observability tools, like we use Langsmith at Solid, and extremely helpful because you can see the plan and all the tool calls and the inputs and the outputs and the state and everything. But you can't just FA through every single step to see what's going on,
right.
and that's just so hard. But yeah, but to your other point, you need people with skills to do this. This is not something that any junior developer can do. A lot of people talk about junior developers are going to be out of their job. AI can do some things of junior developers, but on the other hand, if you're really smart and really good, you're going to have a job as building these really complicated machines,
Yeah.
and creating real value there. So it's a good, humans have a lot of value, but you just need to upskill yourself in that direction.
I've seen that within engineering, I'll say, is that like I feel like the the best engineers have gotten exponentially better with the use of these tools rather than it just sort of leveling the bar for everybody. Like I think the best engineers are most effective at really like leveraging these to the full extent for the reason I told you around like these micro decisions become much more important and impactful. And I think the same will be true in law and tax and all these other things. Like I think it's actually like a really um, exciting future for a lot of these professions because it really like amplifies the hardest and the most important parts of the job. And it like brings those to the surface and makes them more pronounced than they were before.
And actually makes things more interesting for us, I would
Yeah.
say. If you're excited about this stuff, your work is going to become more interesting. Instead of doing the same, maybe mundane and fixing bugs and building yet another API call or something, you're going to be building things that are very
Yeah.
massive and complicated. We are close to our time. I have a few questions that I always ask at the end. This is sort of like a lightning round type of thing.
All right. I'll be
Ask
quick.
you. What? Sorry.
I'll be terse. I'll get to the point. Lightning round
Well,
style.
you can expand on why your answer is, but I want you to try to not think very long. Just, answer whatever comes to mind. So let's start easy. AI tool you can't live without.
Claude Code.
Cloud code. Why?
I find that like it really does this operating system thing well. Like it is a harness for a lot of capabilities, like not just writing code, but like preparing for presentations, thinking through problems. Like I can give it tools in my operating system, like and it works kind of in a way that my brain works as well, which is kind of like I put it on a repo and I'll like let it work through it. So like this idea of like using the file system very natively and using the computer tools very natively uh, is quite extensible. And so I find that I'm able to sort of like take this one thing and manipulate it in a lot of different shapes to do what I need to do. And I don't always sit there and like write code. I often rarely do actually, but like even though I don't, like I'm able to sit there and like find really useful ways to apply it. So that would be my number one right now.
It's very powerful. It's a very, very powerful tool. One tip that I've heard using Cloud Code is if you give it a really good plan, it can run for longer and more independently, and it can think for it more. So, just like, we're talking about the value of humans here. So if you give it a really good sort of PRD, a product requirement document, or a really good plan for it to work off of, then it becomes even more powerful because instead of coming back to you for every single question and saying, oh, should I do this? Should I do that? You say, this is what I need you to do. Here are all the details. These are the tests that I need. And it can run with it a lot longer on its own.
And in a lot of ways, using the tool, it can be Claude or any tool, but using the tool to help craft that plan is like actually most effective.
Yeah.
You sort of ask it like poke holes in this, like let me poke holes in you, like, and you sort of iterate to get a great plan. That is what builds its context for taking the right actions and making the right decisions. And yeah, I think the way in which you use it, that's definitely a pattern that's evolved within my engineering teams to like really focus on that upfront, like context building, planning activity to get most effective use out of them.
An AI myth you'd bust in one sentence.
That we will mitigate hallucinations entirely. Or let me change my answer. This is AGI. That's the myth I bust.
That this is AGI, that we are at AGI.
Yeah, or even that we're close. It doesn't like as powerful as these tools seem, like they still seem far away from AGI to me. And in fact, I mean, like I mentioned, if you like follow the curve of where AI is going, it feels like it's gone farther from AGI than even where it started. Like, in other words, like LLMs now seem like they are experts at operating a computer, like full stop. Like they're just really good at operating a computer, calling system tools, writing code, like calling other tools, reasoning about what to do next. They're not like generally intelligent about the world, but they are highly capable of extending their knowledge to use other tools and systems to get the knowledge they need to take it. So to me, I don't know that that's AGI. They've actually become more narrow in a sense. I think they've become more effective and useful from a commercial standpoint because of that. But like, I don't know that I think that that's AGI.
Yeah, they became more specialized in. They're like really good workers of certain types, and then they'll use all these tools to augment them, but they started really broad and then became really, really good at a certain set of things for a variety of different reasons, potentially.
And there's huge commercial benefit in what they're really good at. So I think there's good reason that there's focus there. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Favorite book, podcast, or resource for builders?
I'm gonna like not answer for builders. I'm just gonna tell you my favorite book is Thinking Fast and Slow.
Okay.
It is my favorite book of all time. It's actually like a social psychology book, and I feel like that book, better than any, has like helped me like understand other people, but also understand myself better. How and when to check my biases and like question what I'm seeing or what I myself may be thinking or feeling in a way that I don't think any other book has. And I would just say it's like made me a much better decision maker about when to use my intuition and when to not, and be confident in my intuition when I feel like it's necessary as well.
I heard great things about that book, and Daniel Kahneman, who wrote it, was a very, very thoughtful person, coming from economics originally, and he passed away, unfortunately, last year.
Yeah, he did.
A lot of insight from this man.
Yeah.
Okay, one prediction for AI in the next 5 years. It is a lightning round.
I told you I would be terse and stuff. It's like I told you, like Daniel Kahneman told me when to trust my intuition and when to not. And
Yeah, exactly. You're like, yeah, that was exactly the previous. It was like, no, in these kinds of questions of the prediction for the next 5 years, maybe I should think for a second longer.
This is bad. I think the biggest prediction for the next 5 years is that it will not scale linearly in terms of effect. I think there will be sort of some like disenchantment somewhere that people start to experience, either because of change management is hard or because like quality isn't quite as good as they wanted to, or we don't solve this like human in the loop problem well enough for a number of reasons. Maybe I think people are going to get frustrated to some degree and perhaps get disillusioned. I do subscribe to the like Bill Gates idea that like these things are overestimated in the short term and underestimated in the long term.
Yes.
So I do believe all the hype that will come to life at some point in the future, but I do think the road to get there might not be as linear as a lot of people think it will be over the next few years.
Like it. This has been really, really interesting. This whole journey of building something that is so, the people are relying on it in some really important activities, and the journey that your team has done at Thomson Reuters has been amazing to hear, Joel. And awesome. It's super interesting to think where this is going to go and how this is going to develop. So obviously we'll keep following you, and maybe have you here again in a year or so and hear how the plans manifested themselves and what ended up being true or not. But even the lessons you shared today have been amazing. So I really appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule, Joel.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate the conversation. It was fun.
Thank you very much. And to all our listeners, if you haven't yet subscribed, then please subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening to it, and see you in the next episode. Thank you.